Thanks for coming, everybody here, everyone watching after the fact. I'm Michael Devins. I'm product manager here at Jamf, focused on our Apple integrations. And as I shared this morning, that means Apple operating system releases, which are critical to our customers that we have support for. But not only that, the new capabilities that come with them. We'll talk about some of those really compelling updates today. And also some of the workflows tied to those capabilities. It's not just enough for us to say, we integrate with Apple School Manager. We power Classroom app. It needs to be in a way that makes sense for your workflows, that allow you to actually support the large-scale environments that you need to support with these technologies. So what you have seen, hopefully, and will continue to see from Jamf is an iterative approach to these technologies. Our education integration is no different, and it's based on your feedback that allow us to shape and improve those with each of the subsequent releases. And I'm especially excited to share about the education functionality today, as I was very closely involved with the teams that built out this functionality and crafting that initial first shipping increment that you guys are all working with or have the ability to work with today. So I'm really excited. This is a close-to-home topic for me. So we'll have a lot to talk about, a lot to share. Before I get into some of the meat and potatoes, I'm curious, hopefully making this not too awkward, but like how many people today use Casper Focus? Works okay, not great. How about Classroom app? Okay. And the whole big shebang Apple School Manager integration? Awesome. Keep those hands up. If you see someone with their hand up, they have some personal experience with this stuff. I'm volunteering on their behalf for you to go and ask them questions after the fact. So it's great to see the mix of people at different stages, because this is very much a lot of moving pieces. But hopefully we can talk through those different pieces and give a bit better clarity and understanding with how they all come together. So the agenda is pretty straightforward. We're talking about the new education functionality. And we're not just talking about this because it's new. At Jamf, we truly believe in Apple's vision of the classroom experience. In fact, as you heard Dean share, we have our own vision of that education classroom experience, and that's our goal of enhancing teacher effectiveness and student learning in the classroom. And we've obviously been helping a lot of education customers, a lot of schools, be effective in the classroom with tools like Casper Focus, or even just integrating with deployment programs, deploying apps, deploying books. We've been in this space for a number of years. We've learned a lot over that time. And our passion for that education experience has only increased over time and intensified most recently with the capabilities that shipped in iOS 9.3 in March. And since that time, we've invested heavily in the product to support these new education workflows and these new capabilities that Apple's opened up for our education customers. So speaking of iOS 9.3, this is kind of the thing that kicked everything off this year. And so it's a good place to start. The timing of this release was atypical. It was not traditional. Not that we can predict every move Apple's going to make, but a fall release is generally what we're used to. So to hear of this sort of different timing with a spring release, it was different, but it was awesome. And it was especially awesome because it allowed us to build functionality into the product sooner. Not that we met every one of your deadlines for getting a deployment queued up over the summer or in the fall. There's obviously a cutoff at some point. But it's great to see how many of you are already using these new technologies, how many of you might cut over mid-year, and especially how many will be able to embrace them in the upcoming school year. So iOS 9.3 kicked off a long tail of capabilities. And we'll touch on just some of these here, just to kind of level set with the group. One of the most remarkable is this new shared iPad capability, allowing you to give students a truly a truly personalized experience on shared hardware. So we're not having to dilute their experience on iPad. We can give them a rich, personalized experience while allowing multiple students to use that same hardware throughout the day to have the same type of personalized learning. Make use of those devices all day and not just a couple hours a day. Additionally, the new app usage restrictions, exciting for education, in fact, exciting for all customers, a brand new capability to show or hide specified apps on a device. I can't tell you the number of different Jamf Nation threads and feature requests that must have been really, really excited when Apple introduced this new capability. And the premise is that you can define via a configuration profile the ability to say, show only these apps, hide these specific apps. You have a lot of control over what your end user's experience is, and especially students in the classroom, it's allowing for a really focused learning environment. Plays a big role with the way you deploy shared iPad as well. And just for clarity, there are 2 apps that can never be hidden with this app usage restriction. One is settings, that's always exposed. And if it's a phone, the phone app is never hidden. Anything else, hide tips, hide mail, hide Safari, hide all of those things, allowing you to really customize that end user experience. And along the same lines, that home screen layout, giving a consistent experience, even if a student is moving between devices, defining, especially in the earlier years, when kids need that consistency to be able to say, go to the dock, that's exactly where the app you need will be. Again, a lot of feature requests around this capability. Home screen layout, not just for education, for all customers, a great enhancement with what can be configured on these devices. The last one I'll touch on in this list is lost mode. For those of you that haven't used lost mode, the important thing to understand is that tracking a device isn't something that we take lightly. I know it's not something that Apple takes lightly, and there have been a lot of workarounds in the market to use an app and hand it off to MDM, and it's something we've never wanted to touch, because to track a student's device is to track a student, and that's just not what we want to do. That's not the business we're in. In fact, a year ago, Apple signed the Student Privacy Pledge, and Jamf was right there, signed it as well. We believe in protecting the end user privacy. And so we were really, really excited when this new lost mode capability was introduced with iOS 9.3, because it allowed for the first time via Apple's MDM specification the ability to put a device into lost mode and actually disable it if it's missing or lost. Also to be able to collect the location via MDM so that you can actually locate a misplaced device if that's what you need to do. And importantly, once you take a device out of lost mode, the end user is notified. So a student, a teacher is never having their location tracked unbeknownst to them. It's a very transparent way to do this sort of lost and found capability while respecting the end user privacy. So those are just some of the sort of greatest hits of iOS 9.3. There's a lot of capabilities in that release, and more following with iOS 10 as Apple continues to iterate the capabilities. The last thing, though, that I'll call out is not necessarily a feature of iOS 9.3, but in conjunction with the release of iOS 9.3, Apple released their own classroom app for teachers in the classroom. This iPad app sort of takes the teacher experience beyond anything that we could achieve with the current technology, and push notifications with Casper Focus. And some of you might be wondering, like, what was our reaction to that? Like, how did that feel? And in a word, we were thrilled, because Apple did what we couldn't do, and that was they brought proximity to this solution in a way that it needed to be, in a way that we couldn't necessarily do effectively, and sort of leapfrogged any experience that anyone could create with that teacher's classroom app experience. Because again, someone said, did you use Casper Focus? We did, and we don't. If 29 of 30 students get locked into an app, that's not mostly a win, that's a failure. And the technology isn't necessarily the right fit. And Apple being able to do this via proximity with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth really uses the right technology to make the right experience in the classroom. Classroom app itself has some requirements to be able to run. So teacher using Classroom app requires a 3rd gen iPad or later, or an iPad mini or later. iOS 9.3 is required, of course. Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are the means by which those devices communicate with the students. Not mentioned here is obviously an MDM provider to actually deploy and configure all of the things required to power the Classroom app experience. But if you haven't used Classroom app yet, I would strongly encourage you to try it out, especially if you've got teachers that are really passionate for the classroom experience. Get it in some of their hands, get some early feedback. It's a really, really rich experience, a great improvement over what we can achieve with Casper Focus. So, it's really easy to talk about, like, just go do Classroom, but what does that take? There are a couple things I want to clarify. One, you don't necessarily need Apple School Manager integration to start using Classroom app in a one-to-one deployment. Those are 2 separate conversations. So you would have the ability to deploy Classroom app as a supplement to the Casper Focus experience for one-to-one student devices, of course, provided they're running the latest operating systems to support it. With our 9.9 release this past spring, we released our first set of capabilities to power the Classroom app and shared iPad. There's a lot of under-the-hood processing that happens to make that successful. So we'll kind of step through what it might take to get this up and running. For those of you that have done it, this might be a refresher. Importantly, hopefully this orients some of you around what it takes to get started with Classroom app. So inside of Settings, Mobile Device Management, there's an all-new Apple Education Support section. And within here, a really unassuming checkbox. But this checkbox actually is doing a lot. And I'll explain sort of an elementary definition of what's going on under the hood, because there's a lot that happens. But I do want to point out that if what we touch on piques your curiosity, you want to understand more, we've got 2 sessions tomorrow at Open Book with the actual engineers that built out these workflows and these technologies that'll be able to give a deeper, in-depth explanation of what happens when you turn on that education support, all the profiles that are getting generated. So if you want more of a technical deep dive, I'd encourage you to check this one out. They'll cover it in great detail. So for the sake of today, for the sake of basic understanding, there's this new type of configuration payload. This configuration defines the relationship between your users and the different groups and departments and the devices that are associated with each of those users. So this might be a student one-to-one device as compared to a shared iPad, as compared to a teacher iPad using Classroom app. And what's important is that every one of those devices, every piece of this puzzle, needs to have some permutation of this education profile, but every single version is just a little bit different and personalized, giving teachers access only to interact with the right students, to give students access only to the right classes, et cetera, et cetera. And that unique permutation is what really makes this a more complex process under the hood. So this is used to put students in classes, to connect teachers with those classes, and actually this profile is used to configure the Classroom app. So unlike this notion of managed app config, where you can deploy a set of configurations down with an app, this education profile is where Classroom app reads and how it can update this profile to how we can update this profile to power Classroom app allows for those ongoing changes to be reflected. It's also used to configure the shared iPad experience. So this one unassuming education payload is responsible for a lot of functionality under the hood, and it's always changing because your students and teachers and classes are always changing. So because of the nature of that change, we knew that this wouldn't be something we were going to ask you to go in and click some boxes and turn some things on and scope and deploy. It's just not realistic because of the way that this workflow lives in your environment. And we recognized that we needed to make a seamless integration so that this could self-sustain once you had it set up to be able to manage for all the changes that occur and automatically deploy those out to the respective devices that need updated profiles. And so we knew we needed a way to do this, and the great news is that we already had classes. We had this concept of classes inside of our product that already served a similar purpose, and we knew that this is a place that we could put a little bit of love to build additional functionality on top of. So we'll put a lot of effort to adapt classes inside of Jamf Pro for both the teacher experience, the student one-to-one experience, and also the shared iPad experience. Again, constantly running under the hood, monitoring for changes, and sending out the right configurations to each of the respective devices. So I mentioned we made some changes. Some of you may have used pre-9.9, post-9.9. You'll recognize some of the new capabilities that we added here. Looks a little different, some new sections. At the heart of it, though, the same basic concepts. We made a change from copy and paste usernames or email addresses here to actually representing the users inside of the product. We did this for a couple of reasons. One, the user experience of this was a little bit more transparent, especially with the addition of not just individuals but groups. But especially this was important because we're making use of all of this associated information to populate the student names for the teacher's Classroom app, to be able to preload the managed Apple IDs onto the shared iPad to make the student's login experience better. So by exposing this, it gave a little bit better transparency with what was actually going in to build these education profiles. Anyone that had email addresses previously, you would have had these updated, and these would now have become user records that you'd see like on the screen here. And as we're touching on users, there are some new aspects to a user, especially as we get later into the Apple School Manager integration. But this brand new capability within Apple School Manager for managed Apple IDs. And we knew that we needed to find a way to associate this information with the users, the new users or the existing users. Especially, this is important for shared iPad. As I mentioned, this is what allows us to make it a really elegant login experience for the students. There's actually a second capability that we use inside of Jamf Pro with utilizing these managed Apple IDs, and it's the new auto-register capability with the volume purchase program, where because your institution owns both the volume purchase program content and the managed Apple IDs that you created on behalf of your users, you can actually bypass the student's end user experience of accepting terms and conditions and authenticating with a password to make a user assignment with the volume purchase program. Well, you might want to do this with apps because it's just a better end user experience. It's critical for books, which, as we know, are user-based assignments. And so this managed Apple ID plays a couple of different roles, and we wanted to make sure that this was associated with our users. And so we actually built a new section onto all of the users, and it's titled Roster. And just to sort of level set on terms, the roster data or the roster API is how we communicate with Apple School Manager. So this roster data that you see here on the user is that data coming from Apple School Manager. In addition to the students, we've got teachers. You can have one or more teachers, again, allowing for all those different permutations and allowing to get every device with the proper permissions for those education profiles. So timeout, what about Casper Focus? We have a lot of customers that still use and rely on Casper Focus, and in short, our classes will continue to power Casper Focus for these one-to-one iPad deployments, even after these changes. And you see there were class times and Apple TV still a part of those classes. So nothing has changed there. But more importantly, this step that we've talked about where we enable education support, allowing you to fire off those education profiles, makes it a relatively small step from Casper Focus to Classroom app as you want to start experimenting with these new capabilities, putting Classroom in the hands of your teachers. So just a note about Casper Focus, continue to power it from classes. But let's continue on because now we get into some of the shared iPad territory of classes. Now, some of you might have used device groups with Casper Focus, continue to do so, absolutely, but importantly, this is now also used for linking the hardware that you're using with shared iPad. So we're dealing with actually multiple elements now, right? We've got the students' users, we've got the teachers, and because it's not a given that everyone has a one-to-one device assigned to them, we've now introduced this third concept of that shared hardware that they might run on. In fact, a student might have a one-to-one device and be prepared to log in on a shared iPad. We can power all of those permutations by linking a group of shared iPads here on the class object. So it's an excellent new option to make sure that you're really utilizing this hardware all day long and not just for a couple of hours. And then we've elevated some configurations that actually pertain specifically to the shared iPad experience. Because every user has maybe a different membership in classes, every user is going to have a unique shared iPad login experience. And this notion of a user-based iOS configuration profile is not something we've ever dealt with before. And importantly, not every configuration profile is supported at the user level. Some are still device level. So we expose sort of two of the most relevant for customizing the shared iPad experience on the class object itself. You can still absolutely assign these at the device level to any one-to-one device or even to a shared iPad, but I just want to point out that these two new capabilities exist here on classes for the purpose of customizing shared iPad. App usage, again, being able to define only the titles that'll appear for a student logging into a shared iPad. And you have to think about this, right? A shared iPad cart might be used by first graders and second graders and third graders. And technically, I'm going to do a device-based app deployment of all of the apps that first graders or second graders or third graders need. But when a third grader logs in, I only want them to see the third grade apps. So yeah, all of the content is installed, but only exposed to the third graders the content they need for their class. And so this allows us to specify that unique configuration at a user level on shared iPad. And same goes for home screen layout, being able to customize the order of those apps and which icons are on the dock, allowing those students to have that personalized experience on shared iPad. Another note about some special sauce that happens under the hood here. these profiles, the app usage restrictions and the home screen layout, the devices don't really want more than one of these. At best, it's a weird experience. At worst, it's nothing. And so we needed to actually look for any student or teacher that's a part of multiple classes on shared iPad, and actually combine and find the sum total of apps for app usage restrictions and the sum total of home screen layout payloads, and combine those down into one so that we're showing the student everything that they're actually expecting. Otherwise, we might have some unexpected results when someone goes to log into that shared iPad, because as you know, configuration profiles become sort of overlapping and more restrictive, not necessarily the sum total of all of these things. So we do that merging when you do these configurations at a class level so that if a student's supposed to see 4 apps, they actually see 4 apps. Just a note about shared iPad, by the way. You're probably aware that there are some specific hardware requirements for shared iPad. I just want to share exactly what those are. iPad Pro, iPad Air 2, iPad Mini 4, and then again, the same minimum software requirement, iOS 9.3 or later. Managed Apple ID is actually what we're using to log in, or what the student is using to log in to that shared iPad to get their personalized experience, and they're logging in against Apple School Manager, not against Jamf Pro. And sort of an asterisk on caching server, it's there to optimize content delivery. You're probably aware that iCloud is used to back up all this user data and re-download it if the student's going to a new device for the first time. There's a lot of network infrastructure and benefits to caching server, so talk to your network team or your Apple team or your Jamf team just to make sure you understand all of these things that can make that shared iPad experience as rich and as seamless as possible. We don't want to create unnecessary delay for students logging in, so that can be definitely be a helpful element to include. So we've talked about some of the requirements. Let's talk a little bit about how do I actually get these set up inside of Jamf Pro so that I can start using shared iPads. Shared iPad is configured as a part of a Prestage setting, which means it comes in through the device enrollment program. Importantly, these devices need to be in your device enrollment program that is associated with Apple School Manager. So we'll talk a bit later about how to get started and how to get upgraded, but you want to make sure that everything is unified so that this experience is powered properly. And so when we look at Prestage, we added a few new capabilities here to support shared iPad devices. In addition to supervising a device, which all shared iPads are, there's subsequently an option to make that device a shared iPad. If it's not compatible hardware, it just will ignore this flag and proceed. If it is compatible, this is actually going to reboot the device and go through a bit of a setup phase, an additional configuration for the purposes of shared iPad. You'll notice that just at the bottom of this screenshot, there's this notion of number of users. You have to decide at the time that the device enrolls, we need to tell it how many user partitions, for lack of a better conceptual term, need to be created on this device. Too few partitions, and students have way more information or way more storage than they need. And importantly, if I made 3 partitions and every day 4 students touch this device, someone's data is getting blown away every day, and someone's data is re-downloading completely every day. If I define too many partitions, I say 15 partitions and only 4 students use this, well, now I've unnecessarily constrained the storage capacity allocated for each of those students. So this is a bit of art here to decide. The easiest litmus test, as we've discussed with customers, is think about how many students will touch these devices on a consistent basis on any given day. And that gives you some good guidance around how you want to define the number of users that these iPads are configured for. You can absolutely erase and re-enroll them, but it'd be great to give some consideration to this up front so you don't have to go through that learning process. Again, just to reiterate, all this data does get cached up to iCloud, but what we want is we want to make sure that the data persists on the devices whenever possible, because that allows the students to pick up exactly where they left off the next day without that unnecessary delay of downloading all of their data before they can actually start in class. So that's configuring shared iPad through Prestage. And so we sort of get to this intersection. New shared iPad, but someone says, well, wait, I've been doing shared iPad for a long time. That's absolutely true. A number of our customers have been doing a version of shared iPad for years. The premise is it's supervised, there's limited personalized content on this device, and it's kind of just this agnostic screen that students can interact with, but their personal progress isn't necessarily stored. as compared to this new option of a personalized shared iPad that the new capabilities in iOS 9.3 deliver. Both are valid workflows, especially considering the hardware investment many schools have made, the compatibility that may or may not be there with your existing hardware as compared to your future hardware. Understand that we're talking about not just one-to-one and shared, but distinguishing between that shared model, personalized versus non-personalized. And this is just another tool that we have as we look at deploying iPads into the future. So mix and match. Your job is to craft and create and organize the best experience to utilize your technology for your teachers and your students. And you'll know what's right, and that'll shift over time, but just understand you've got a lot of arrows in your quiver as you build the appropriate iPad deployment for your school. So we've talked a lot of conceptually. I've done a lot of hand-waving around education profiles and some of the different things that go on under the hood. And I use this word dynamic like it's just a simple thing. I want to illustrate some of what happens underneath all of this processing to power these devices with the education configuration profile. First, let's look at a one-to-one student example. So the green iPad on the left is Mr. Jacob, and Mr. Jacob has 4 students in his device, or in his class. And these are one-to-one devices. So Mr. Jacob knows of these 4 devices and the students that are associated with them. That powers his classroom app. And John and Beth and Aaron and Joe, they each have an education profile that says Mr. Jacob is your teacher, and he has permission, certificates and all of that, to interact with me via classroom app. And if a change were to occur, let's say Drew joins the class, well, now a couple things need to change. One, we need to make sure that Drew knows who his teacher is, that he's a part of this class. And Mr. Jacob needs an updated education profile because he now has another student as a part of his class roster. John, Beth, Aaron, John, they don't care. They don't need new education profiles. They're left alone. This is an example of only sending out those changes when they're detected, only to the devices that are impacted. Another dimension now when we talk about shared hardware. Again, Mr. Jacob and the 4 students and the 4 iPads, we've got sort of another variable at play. Mr. Jacob needs to know about his students in the class. For this class, he might have multiple. He needs to know about the shared hardware that might be used for his class, because any student could log in on any one of these devices. And to that end, every single one of these shared iPads needs to know of all the classes that might log into them, all of the students that might log into each of those classes, and all of the teachers that are responsible for interacting via classroom app with any of those students in the class. And again, if a new student is added, Mr. Jacob needs to know, and every one of these shared iPads needs to know. It just gives you a sense of the amount of change management that's happening under the hood anytime a class roster changes. And we know that changes are going to occur. It's the nature of these deployments as they change over time. Students come in and out of classes, teachers get added, the device deployments grow over time, and more people want to take advantage of shared iPad. One-to-one iPad, classroom app, all of these things. At the end of the day, what we need you to know, this is not to scare you, this is not to make it daunting, but rather understand that Jamf Pro is here to make sure that we're handling all of that complexity under the hood so you can focus on your deployments and the implementations where you need to intervene, configuring these the first time so they can self-sustain, so teachers can be effective in the classroom and students can focus on their learning. But that still can be a lot of work for IT to maintain, even with all the automation, which is why I do want to talk a bit more now about how Apple sort of completed this circle with their introduction of Apple School Manager, because this really does solve for that missing piece of the change management with your roster data, your student information system, the class roster is changing, students getting added and removed. So Apple School Manager integrates and plays sort of middleman between your student information system data and your Jamf Pro instance to make sure that all of those changes can be liaised on a regular basis so that all of those deployed iPads are configured and updated accordingly. Again, this is kind of touching on the automation that can be built upon the framework we've already discussed. So I touched on this briefly, but Jamf Pro communicates with Apple School Manager via the roster API. This is something that we can configure, again, within those education settings we were looking at just a moment ago. It's another tab next to General for configuring and enabling Apple School Manager. We're authenticating Jamf Pro into Apple School Manager to get at this sensitive student and teacher and class data, this SIS data. And so we authenticate via the device enrollment program token or the device enrollment program instance. So you'll actually specify, because it's not a guarantee that all of your device enrollment program tokens are linked with Apple School Manager. You'll specify which one is actually going to point us to your instance. And just as sort of a tip, these tokens, they get created, they get destroyed, they get changed. It might be a great idea to make an MDM server inside of Apple School Manager solely for the purpose of connecting so that devices aren't getting added, removed. I'd hate to see that token destroyed and your connection with the roster API cut short. If you make a dedicated instance, you can ensure that no one making device changes will break your connection to Apple School Manager. And this is going to allow us to access all of that class and user and teacher data coming down from Apple School Manager through the roster API. You'll also see there's an option here to define both when the sync occurs, maybe not at 9 a.m. on a Monday or on any day if you're doing it daily. Maybe you don't want it syncing daily, you can go less frequently, but those daily changes really allow you to keep this up to date. There's also a force sync option if you want to reflect changes immediately. Keep in mind that we're downloading all of the new data or all of the data from Apple School Manager. So not that it's a huge performance hit, but just again, be considerate about when you schedule these. Don't have it at the same time as some other events like log flushing or first day of school, 9 a.m., things like that. So you can define these sync intervals here and customize that at any time. I also want to point out this option, this notion of matching criteria. It's super critical when we think about users. Users were already sort of complex to manage, and we're maybe taking it up a notch here because you've got your directory service, you've got your student information system, you've got users inside of Jamf Pro. A lot of these users that are going to come through the roster API from Apple School Manager, many of them likely already exist inside of Jamf Pro, and the last thing we want to do is duplicate those records and have sort of a disconnect between what you've got configured and assigned and what you're using on an ongoing basis within classes. So you have the ability to define via some operators, and you can do this in either direction, how you want to match the users coming from Apple School Manager against the users that are already inside of Jamf Pro. You get to define these, and then this is what's appended to that roster tab on the users. And if no user is determined to be matching, we'll create a brand new user from that import, so you don't have to have everything inside of Jamf Pro. We'll create a new one if we don't detect a match. But these changes on, for instance, the nightly sync, will propagate changes to classes, changes to users, and update those education profiles for any of these users or classes that have been imported. And this is where we can configure those intervals. And that leads us now into this notion of, okay, well, so I got to import stuff. Like when we looked at the design and thinking again about talking with customers and their workflows and how you're using this, what we didn't want was just to categorically import everything. Whether that's because not all users might be starting with shared iPad, you want to sort of step into it with just some classes or groups at a time. Perhaps you're not using the classroom app with all classes, so let's not clutter that object inside of Jamf Pro. So we have the ability to selectively import content. Every environment is different, so you'll figure this out for yourself. But be cognizant as you're designing your implementation to think specifically about that matching criteria. Ideally, we all have Loctite matching criteria. Maybe you've got a student ID number that's consistent across your LDAP into SIS inside of Jamf Pro. Maybe you've got some other sort of global identifier, a student ID number or a user ID. But think about those matching workflows as you're designing this. We want you to have high confidence that the matching criteria you set will truly match users, but know that we will also handle if you've got users that are conflicting, allowing you to pick which one matches. So once we've got this configured, in addition to making a new user at the top, we have the ability to import users. You can do all users or be selective, for instance, by class, and this is where I can bring in just a handful of users at a time. You can preview any new users that will be created. The next tab, any existing users that are being updated. Maybe we're appending the managed Apple ID. And then existing users that have already been imported previously. I learned through this process about something called the Levenstein distance. It's a pretty sophisticated bit of whatever. But the gist of it, the engineers were telling me, we've got a great way to do matching. We can look for the shortest distance between this user and that user to give high confidence of user matching. Anyways, I wanted to share that there is a lot of intelligence going on under the hood to detect matches, to be smart about this. But hopefully you can lock down some bulletproof matching criteria that avoids the need for this matching an intervention to say this user or that user. We can also import classes, which does bring users along with them. While I have the ability to import users, as I just showed you, this is the ideal method with the way that we thought through this workflow to automate the ongoing maintenance of classes. So again, just like we could import users, we can import classes at the top once we've got that Apple School Manager integration set up. And I can select one class, I can select multiple classes, and again, I'll be able to preview the new users, existing users, and bring those in. And now those are classes to be configured just as we saw up front. Again, plugging in the front end of class changes, users being added or removed, so that the rest of the automation occurs. And so, for instance, that nightly sync with Apple School Manager might add 2 students to a class. They get imported, matched, or created. Education profiles automatically get sent out and updated for all of those users as a part of the class, really enabling the automation of that classroom import workflow inside of Jamf Pro. That's a lot of stuff. I share it not to make it sound complicated. There's a lot of complication happening. But what I want you to do is have high confidence and great clarity in understanding what's happening under the hood so you can design with these considerations in mind. These are being dynamically generated and sent out. So really it's about turning on the functionality, but just being conscious about what's happening in your environment so that we can truly power the right deployment, giving teachers effective iPad experiences in the classroom and students the great learning experience that we want to deliver. So let's kind of just recap a few of the themes, the things that we touched on, and then we'll have some time for questions as well. But we talked about a few different workflows. One is this notion that we already had classes. You might have used Casper Focus. You can build on the shoulders of those elements to enable Classroom, using Classroom with your teachers, although we'll still power Casper Focus as well. We talked about deploying shared iPad and how we use the managed Apple IDs, how we set up these DEP iPads through a Prestage if they meet those specific requirements, enabling that multi-user personalized shared iPad experience. We talked about how every time Jamf Pro syncs with Apple School Manager, we can reflect all those changes through the imported users or classes and make use of that selective import to ensure that only the classes we care about are seeing that automation occurring. And again, that key workflow of absolutely import users, but class changes are where we see so much of the change happening. So think about it importing classes, and those classes will flow through to the users. This is where you'll see some real benefits around the automation you get with the student information system flowing through Apple School Manager into the classes, powering Classroom app and shared iPad. I want to share a few resources as well. Some of you may already be all over these. Maybe you're considering a brand new Apple deployment, or you're sort of getting spun up for the first time with iPad in the classroom. You've come to the right conference. Apple.com/education/IT is a great primer to get a good overview of these elements. There's a great iBook there, some videos on Classroom app you can use to socialize within your schools. You saw the show of hands earlier. Talk to these people. Some of them have done it. Many of them are working through it now. And work with your Apple team and your Jamf team to really make sure you've got a solid understanding so you have a great first experience and your users have a great first experience with these new technologies. If you've already got the device enrollment program going or the volume purchase program, that's great. There's an upgrade process whereby you'll actually convert your deploy.apple and your VPP account to be a part of Apple School Manager. And you'll see these resources online as well, but upgrading your institution to Apple School Manager is a great step-by-step for what you can expect. Work closely with your Apple team on this upgrade process to make sure you've got all your elements in place. Just a little public service announcement. This is a really important one that I want to call attention to. You want to make sure to consolidate any disparate accounts you have across the device enrollment program, and especially if you have any legacy volume purchase program accounts. make sure to get those consolidated. There's a process outlined here. You can contact AppleCare for education. If you have specific questions, contact your Apple team. AppleCare probably wouldn't love me endorsing that as your first step. So talk to your Apple team first before you call AppleCare. There's a process online. To get these merged, you need to do this before you upgrade to Apple School Manager. It cannot be done after. You want to make sure all these elements are tied together before you upgrade to Apple School Manager. So we talked about a lot of things. I used the better part of 40 minutes here. We started with this really simple mission of enhancing teacher effectiveness and student learning in the classroom. And we've talked about all the different ways you might use these, some of these, all of these technologies, to put Apple's latest technologies into the classroom. You're going to have a lot of questions, I'm sure. Again, reference that expert session, and there's a Q&A as well around some of the education functionality that I'd encourage you to attend. Talk to your Jamf team, talk to your Apple team, talk to fellow attendees. We're all here to help. This is a great place for all of us to learn together in the same way that we learn on Jamf Nation together. Thank you for all of your attention. It's a ton of content that I was putting at you. I'll invite Joe, if anyone was able to get a network connection and tweet a question. We can try and handle some of those. What do you got?
All right. Very good. So we do have a number of questions, so
Great.
We'll try to get to those that we can. I do understand we only have a few minutes here, so there are some additional sessions. You know who Michael Devins is now, so you can find him as well, or talk to your Jamf, your Jamf team. So one was, could you explain the process of getting student photos into the system?
We didn't touch on that much here. In addition to the education support that we enabled and the Apple School Manager integration we enabled, there's also an option where you can tie in a student photo server. There's some documentation on our knowledge base for how to set up that student photo server to actually populate as a part of the classroom app or the shared iPad experience. It's not something that's delivered through the roster API, and it's not something that we host inside of Jamf Pro. The expert sessions tomorrow that I mentioned will also dive into some of the more intricacies around setting up that student photo server. But that is another element you can bring in. Otherwise, you'll get the colored monograms, which is still a great experience. Student photos would definitely take it up a notch.
All right, and we have a couple of questions related to student information systems, specifically Infinite Campus. Wondering first off about some options to maybe add sections or some more descriptions around classes.
I am not the authority on student information systems, so I'll make that disclaimer up front. And what I will say is, I'll do a bit of a dance, and I'll say, talk to your Apple team, because they'll have the latest information and the best information about which student information systems are supported and to what extent. I will also tell you that I understand there's student information system, sort of vanilla, and then there's the way you might customize that information to adapt it to meet the needs of your organization. There's an option, in addition to direct integration with Apple School Manager, to do an SFTP connection where you can export data, including your customized data, and bring that into Apple School Manager. So know that there are some different ways that you might go about that might better meet your needs as you have custom fields. But just understand that that's where talking to your Apple team will give you the latest and the best information around how best to deploy whichever student information system through Apple School Manager.
Okay, and another similar related one. So when you're merging and pulling in users, if you get some strange information that's associated with some of your managed Apple IDs, how could they maybe change that to match up the users?
So there isn't necessarily a process built in to undo and rematch people. What you might be best served with is identifying those, and first make sure you understand, is it a matching criteria issue? Is it a data issue that they got appended in the wrong way? At this time, it's probably something where you'll just delete those impacted users and re-import them. That being said, that sounds destructive, and I don't want to make a mass endorsement on that without understanding your specific situation. So contacting your Jamf support team might be the best way to understand if there's a product enhancement we need to make, or if it's simply a data integrity issue with the matching criteria.
All right, and I think there's some other questions here that are a little bit more specific. So there's some specific issues with digital textbooks and things like that. I would encourage you to file a support case if you have a specific issue related to your account that you'd like to talk to us about. Go ahead and get with your Jamf team, and they can help you out. File a case, and we'll follow up with you on those. So I want to be clear about acknowledging that there are some things that people are asking about that we won't be able to address specifically, but please follow up with your Jamf representative and talk through those. There are also some questions that are not necessarily Apple School Manager and Classroom app, but maybe around lost mode. And so I'd like to touch on just a few of those as well.
Sure.
As we've got about a minute left here. So one of the things that came up was when you're enabling lost mode, and this is a recommendation, to send the clear password command along with the enable lost mode in case of a restart. So just wondering your opinion and thoughts on that.
I understand why that might be a requirement as it relates to secure access to a Wi-Fi network. I will say that if any device with a passcode reboots, it's no longer accessing secure Wi-Fi networks, and so for reasons like lost mode where you might want it to, I could see that being a best practice. I'm not sure that's something that I've specifically encountered, but if you have, I would love to understand that. That might be you doing extra work when we could make a product enhancement. To make sure I understand that better, I'd love whoever asked that question to come talk to me. I'd love to know more. But that's probably the heart of what that's touching on.
Okay. So for other questions, we are at time now. So feel free to follow up with Michael Devins, with your Jamf team. We do have some booths out there as well. There's a solutions booth. So please reach out. And remember, of course, our wonderful community of folks on Jamf Nation. So get those discussions going, and you can all help each other as well. If it's a specific issue, please come to us and we can help you.
Awesome. Thanks for coming, everybody. Have a great conference.